I'm Michael Payan. I'm the marketing director at American Grassfed Association, and I want to thank everybody that's here tonight, especially our panelists, and of course all our attendees for being at Why Your Dinner Matters, the solutions in your purchasing decisions. We came up with this event looking at the issues that are in our current industrialized food system and realizing that some of the responsibility is in our own hands, and we may be able to even find some of those solutions on our very own dinner plates. With me here tonight, I have Carrie Richards, Sherri Duggar, Carrie Balkcom, and Dr. Chris Grobbel, and I want to give them the opportunity to all introduce themselves, and we'll get started right away. So Sherri, if you want to take the lead.
Sure, thank you. I am Sherri Duggar. I'm the Executive Director of Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. We are a national organization that has served as a mobilizing force to empower communities to protect themselves from the damages caused by industrial livestock operations, and also to advocate for a food system built on regenerative practices, justice, democracy, and resilience. We have technical experts, independent family farmers, and rural residents who work for us. And when asked for help, we offer free support, providing communities the knowledge and skills to protect their right to clean water, air, and soil, and to a healthy and vibrant food future. So thank you.
Absolutely. Carrie, do you want to go next? Carrie Richards?
Sure. My name is Carrie Richards. I'm a co-owner with my siblings of Richards Grassfed Beef. We are out in California, and I run our home ranch in Organ House, California, called Richards Land and Cattle. We are AGA certified and EOV certified through the Savory Institute, and happy to be here.
Thank you. And Carrie Balkcom?
Good evening. Thank you. I'm Carrie Balkcom with the American Grassfed Association. I'm the executive director, and I work with Michael. And Carrie Richards is one of our producers, and Sherri and I have worked together many years, and it's an honor to have Chris on the call with us today. And I'm looking forward to a great conversation. And American Grassfed is the first grass-fed certification in the United States, and we are USA only. We don't certify anybody outside the US, so it's very important to us that our producers get their premium in the marketplace. And there's a lot of information on our website, so I won't continue on with that, but I'm thrilled to be introduced to Chris.
Well, thank you, Carrie. Christopher Grobbel, and I'm in Northwest Lower Michigan with Grobbel Environmental and Planning Associates. And I've been at this kind of work, which is working with local units of government, landowners, industry, private property folks and interests, land trusts, for about 33 years now as a consultant. Started out in government, and also have taught for many years at university level these topics. And I'm an environmental quality analyst and have spent a good deal of time also in court testifying about environmental issues. Happy to be here. I've been able to work with a number of groups around the country on issues of industrial farming and the impact on environment. So thank you very much. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Dr. Grobbel. So we have quite a diverse set of backgrounds here, but definitely some overlap over the agricultural area. And I want to open things up with from everyone's perspective. What do you think that the problems are with our current industrialized food system? And I would like to open this up with a little bit of my own experience. I grew up across the street from 100,000 chickens. They had a poultry operation across the street from us. And, growing up as a child next to this, I had a lot of bad experiences because of contamination not being handled correctly, and, pollution and mortality not being handled correctly. It stemmed from sometimes getting off of my school bus and, throwing up outside because the stench was like so intense, to, parents didn't want to let their kids come to play with my house because it smelled so bad outside there. And we eventually got driven out of the area after experiencing a lot of health effects, a lot of issues in our community politically, and it was quite an experience. And I want to just share a little bit of my experience there and how it impacted my life. But to open it up to everyone else, Sherri, if you want to go ahead and get started from your perspective, what do you think that the issues are with our industrialized food system?
Sure. Thanks for sharing your own personal story. Your story is a lot of what we see in our work with Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. We often discuss the externalized costs of cheap food. So the cost that most people don't see when they're buying, you know, a cheap hamburger or fries at a fast food restaurant, like the environmental degradation, climate change acceleration, food safety recalls, the loss of competition in the marketplace, the loss of transparency and truth in food labeling, the economic and quality of life burdens that rural communities like yours experience, Michael. So there's animal welfare issues, there's assault on public and ecological health. So there's a lot of real costs that are being experienced because of the industrial food system. We saw this in real time last year, specifically when the pandemic hit, the working conditions, the poor wages, the lack of concern over the health and safety of meat and poultry line workers, the lack of fair prices for farmers. So the mass killing and burial of animals, et cetera. All of this is because of this very highly consolidated food system. 4 corporations, Tyson, Smithfield, JBS, and Cargill, collectively control over 80% of US beef, pork, and poultry production. So that monopolization of that marketplace gives these companies the power to exploit farmers, ranchers, food system workers, animals. They sell this inferior, nutritionally inferior food with misleading labels. They skirt regulations and federal laws, extract wealth from rural communities, and the list goes on. They pollute our water, our air, et cetera. So there's a lot of issues that we see in our work at Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. When farms scale to those industrial size operations, our communities suffer. They lose farmers, they lose diversity, biodiversity. Families oftentimes move away, like yours had to. Schools close, hospitals close, butcher shops close, mom and pop grocery stores close. I've lived in lots of small towns like this that I'm describing. Wealth that's being extracted from those rural communities isn't just money. It's also, you know, that quality of life, that sense of community and public health that I spoke of, and the vitality of the environment. So all of these things are negative impacts of industrial scale operations coming into a community or expanding. And so I guess it's that these operations come in, they bring adverse environmental impacts like air, land, and water pollution. They present public health risks. They cause social divisiveness, which we see oftentimes in our work as well, pitting neighbor against neighbor, farmer against farmer, and oftentimes family member against family member.
Absolutely. If anyone wants to pick it up from there, I don't want to. I'll let anyone who feels obligated.
I'll speak to kind of the environmental side of things and really springboarding off of what Sherri said. We have to reframe, I think, this whole concept of the concentrated animal feeding operation. What they really are in my mind, in terms of the environment, water quality, they're concentrated waste generation facilities where we have an industry. It's not farming. We have an industry that essentially is allowed to create waste that is of a nature that is far, far hotter, if you will, in terms of contaminants. The levels of nutrients and bacterioids and other things in this waste are extremely high. But the critical thing is that the waste is not treated. It is applied on farm fields in the hope of utilizing the nutrient value. And it's a waste stream that goes directly out into the environment, onto private property, along lakes and streams and creeks and drains. And there aren't any other industries like that. There aren't any other industries that I know of that are allowed to, under the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, you know, essentially discharge untreated waste. So we can get into this a little bit more, but there are a number of policy problems where we're not effectively managing that waste. And it results in water quality degradation. And it's inherent, in my experience, it's inherent in the industry. It's not like it happens occasionally here and there, but it's the norm. We have many states with kind of a hands-off approach. The states that are trying to do the very best they can to regulate the waste stream are falling down and having, you know, surface water quality problems because of the way we have approached this. So we have to step back and really rethink the whole notion of whether these kinds of facilities are allowed in the future and if they are, how we're going to manage them. And, we need some, probably some federal leadership on how we approach this across states, because it varies so much. In my work, I get to work all over the country, in court and on the ground. And studies I've done in Southeast Michigan and Northwest Ohio along the Erie, 66% of all the CAFOs that we were monitoring surface water quality above and below were violating, water quality standards. So it's the norm in the industry that there are problems. So, with that, we will work toward some solutions later in the call, but we've got a great deal of work to do as it relates to this industry.
Either of the Carries want to pick it up from there on what the problems are with the current industrialized food system. Again, I want to encourage the attendees. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom. If you submit your questions, we'll get to those as we finish up the predefined ones and get into attendee questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A chat function at the bottom. And go ahead, whoever would like to.
I'll go. Sherri and Chris touched on a lot of, the high level issues. We run a grass-fed beef operation out in California, and with when you're a small farm or ranch and you're trying to get started, everything kind of funnels you towards getting bigger. Like we couldn't get a small enough warehouse to store any of our meat because we weren't big enough. We couldn't get good deals on harvesting at the slaughterhouses because we weren't big enough. And so everything kind of funnels you towards this bigger is better efficiency machine. But people are really requesting the smaller, people that you can communicate with, the person that actually grows the animal that you're going to be eating. And the demand for our product is high, but it's very hard to get processing done. It's very hard to get, harvest. Like last year in the pandemic, we got bumped because we're not big enough in our slaughter facility to the next day. And so it just one day doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you have all your ranchers are used to shipping on a certain day, it really screws with your schedule. And we had to make some crazy adjustments and increase our numbers to keep our spots, and numbers we weren't comfortable with at first. And so everything's kind of funneling you towards getting bigger and faster and more efficient. And sometimes that's not the route you want to take as a small producer. And so those are the issues that we've seen, especially lately.
Thank you, Carrie. And Malcolm?
My turn. I got involved with grass-fed. First of all, I grew up in a very small town in South Florida where winter vegetables and cattle were the main economies when I was growing up. We were the generation where everybody said get away from the farm, and we did. We were very successful at moving away from our ranches and our farms, and we moved away. And all of a sudden, through topsy-turvy moves and this and that and the other thing, I ended up in the food system with chefs. And I was on a field trip with chefs who were conscious of food supply, and a lot of things led me there. But all of a sudden I realized that they had no clue where their food was coming from either. And these are people that are putting food on your plate. So it was very telling to me that these chefs didn't know anything about food. They knew how to cook, but it was interesting. Just about that time in 2003, there was a move for the USDA to allow grass-fed label claim, which is what you see on the packages, to allow grass-fed to mean 20% grain, antibiotics, and hormones in confinement, and call it grass-fed. So a very small group of very conscious farmers and ranchers met in Denver. There were 13 of us in that first meeting, and I was invited. And I never left. I've been there since day one. And we have tried to keep the integrity of what Carrie's family and other families in the United States are trying to do by putting good, clean, and fair food on your plates. And it's been almost 20 years now. Somebody reminded me of that the other day, and I said, it doesn't seem that long. And the other thing is too, is that to see the next generation again of people like Carrie who have come back to their farms and are making making a life with their kids and the next generation. So I've now gone back to the farm a little bit, but it's very telling. The other thing, when I go back to my hometown where I was raised, is that all the wealth is extracted out of that community now. It's no longer really viable. The farm workers are there, but it's very poor. There's no real businesses anymore. It's all fast food. It's very, very, very sad to see these once thriving, very small economies are gone. And it's hopefully we could bring that back. And something that Carrie brought up in her conversation was the access to processing. The consolidation of markets has made it very difficult for these small family farms to get their products to market. So we're also working on that as well. And what Chris is doing is bringing the story of how this is degrading our environment, and show what Sherri is doing with the same stories. It's very important for us to work with groups like that to bring this to you all, to make sure that that we get the real story out there, and not the little red barn on the package of the meat that doesn't mean anything, that the real true stories. So it's important.
So it's the problems from the industrialized food system rob the health and wealth from communities, the environment, make it harder for the small producer to compete, and many more countless issues. How can we find solutions on our own dinner plate, keeping in mind that consumers have some sort of accountability when they go and they make a purchasing decision, and that some of this responsibility should be thought of when making those decisions? So how can we find solutions on our own plate?
Well, you know, from a higher level view, you all, we need to kind of internalize the external costs, first of all. Water quality degradation, nuisance odors, you know, insect problems in communities, the whole host of issues that accompany this kind of land use need to be internalized, because the public pays the cost in public health, in loss of drinking water quality, surface water quality, recreation, fishing, whatever it may be. You know, we're all paying the cost for this. So we, as the old saying goes, you either pay now or you pay later, and we are paying later. So we know better. We know how to fix this kind of thing, but from a very kind of beginning of this conversation, one thing is to have adequate regulations that essentially take those costs off the shoulders of the public and put them on the shoulders of the producers, who are then going to turn around and pass that cost on to the public. So you know how all that works. But if we're going to protect environment, if we're going to protect property values, people's health, we've got a Wild West regulatory environment in many states right now. And the best of states are struggling with this land use to internalize those externalized costs.
If I can follow up on some of what Chris just said, which was terrific. I think that idea, what he's suggesting is that, you know, instead of the taxpayer paying for this system, the actual corporations need to pay for the costs that they're putting on all of us, right? Through all of this pollution, all these public health problems, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about it from a consumer standpoint, if we're talking about solutions on our dinner plate, from a consumer standpoint, taxpayers pay upfront for these heavily subsidized systems. So agriculture, I'm in Indiana, everything that is growing around me is corn and soybeans. 60% of the corn and soybeans in the country is going to feed livestock operations. It's not going to feed people, it's going to feed these animals going through these industrialized systems. Those agriculture systems are heavily subsidized. People like Carrie Richards are not heavily subsidized to be able to put her product on someone's plate. We are paying upfront through taxes in order for that agriculture system to be sustainable. It is not sustainable on its own. So in order for us to then get this cheap food at the end, for it to go through this system, the supply chain, to go through these processing plants, these distribution systems, all of this stuff that's got a lot of grants attached to it, or a lot of funding attached to it, I should say, in order for it to come to this product, this cheap hamburger that we can get at a fast food restaurant that we're going to then eat, probably going to be filled with a whole bunch of corn syrup and things like that, and byproducts and all of this other stuff. And then we end up getting sick at the end of, we have these issues with cancer on the rise, all of these other health problems that are on the rise. So we're paying at the end as well with our health, and all of the environmental problems that are happening here that are going to be long, after, that are going to last long after we're gone. So there's all of these externalized costs that Chris is talking about in a system where we're actually paying for it to happen, both at the front and at the back, right? With the problems that we're experiencing from this. So if you take if you switch that around and stop subsidizing these corporate entities and these industrial entities that are getting all of this funding, and we actually put it into operations like Carrie Richards, and we help her to get her processing, and we help her to get her distribution, her infrastructure built so that she can actually reach markets, so that people can actually get the food that she raises, then we're helping to solve a lot of these problems. We're actually going to have communities feeding communities. So then we're going to get back to what Carrie and I were talking about with these extracted wealth communities where there's nothing left. We need more farmers on the land. We need more farmers in these rural areas that are growing this food, and we need policy, as we'll talk about later, that supports them. From a consumer standpoint, then you have to think about, okay, most people at this point probably can't afford the food that comes from an independent family farmer who's out there growing food and is dealing with not getting subsidized, food or operations or incentivized in any way by the government. So they're actually paying a higher price. So we have to talk about whether or not they're going to be eating less meat, because obviously we eat a lot of meat in this country. We have to talk about whether or not we want to, choose eating less meat and eating better quality meat, making sure that your farmer in terms of like where you get your eggs, your dairy, and your meat. If nothing else, making sure that you get it from, those three products from someone that you know how they're raising their food, you can trust them, you have a relationship with them. So really it's all about, the solution is all about the relationship, which is completely not available whenever you're talking about a corporate controlled system. So I think it's really about building those relationships and making sure that you can at least take small steps to make changes in what you're eating, so that you can, and actually at the same time calling for better policy, better regulation, which Chris mentioned, and getting involved as an engaged consumer. So Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Future talks about a food citizen, and they had a food citizen project where they talk about being a conscious consumer and really learning about these issues that we're talking about tonight, and taking whatever steps you can just to start changing your eating habits and your buying habits. Because somebody said accountability. I think, Michael, you said accountability. I think of it as power, truly power. Consumers have power to create change in the system.
Absolutely. And considering that $2 a pound or $3 a pound using get ground beef in the store is, when you couple in the health effects and the effects on communities and small producers being choked out, what is the actual cost to us in the end? I guess that brings us to Carrie Richards. And I guess on top of how we can find solutions on our own dinner plate, how can we more specifically find your solutions on our own dinner plate if we're on the West Coast?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. We sell grass-fed beef and pastured pork on our website, which is richardsgrassfedbeef.com. Something that, I don't know, somebody brought up is the cost, the cheap hamburger that you're getting, and then somebody looks at our meat and they're like, oh, I can't afford that. That it's so frustrating for a producer, because we're working so hard to be as efficient as possible so that I don't have to sell off my land into little individual plots of land to afford keeping it. It's a very frustrating position to be in because I want to sell to my local community, and a lot of the people in my local community probably won't buy our meat because it's too expensive. And so we really have to get to a point where the smaller producer, like, I hate to talk about subsidies for the smaller producer, but maybe like helping us smaller producers find processing when we're first starting out, helping us, like maybe we group up with other small producers to get better rates. But those, like giving power to the smaller producer, whether that's through like a American Grass-Fed Association or any other organizations like this, that's going to give the smaller producer power and confidence to go out there and start their own business. But it's very overwhelming when like we started off selling 9 animals and we got laughed out of the room in most of the conversations and processing. So helping like an organization like this is very, very helpful. And Carrie knows I cold called almost everyone in California when I started off to get advice on all of this stuff. But I think conversations like this and organizations to help the producer get started is going to help us build these bigger communities.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think that there's so much work to be done in this country on so many different topics, but there are low hanging fruit, if you will. The USDA in 2021 has $146 billion with a B budget. And about 120 billion of that is like, earmarked for certain programs. I certainly think there are funds available to help the Carrie Richards and Richards, grass-fed beef farms of our country, should we choose to put that sort of assistance there. So we need to really rethink where the dollars are flowing and why we're subsidizing industrial farming instead of family farming. Because with very few exceptions, all of our elected officials want us to believe we're doing just the opposite, and we're not. So the resources are there. We could, as a solution, put a great deal of resources into all public school food programs in the whole nation are buying from the Richards farms of the country as opposed to Smithfield. There's so many easy things we could do that we're not doing yet. Seeing little bits of that percolating around in the Midwest and where I live, but it's at great cost to the school districts, for example, who are choosing to do that. But the education that comes along with it is priceless, if nothing else. The health benefits are priceless. Having a ready-made local market for local growers is priceless, because the same people who may be concerned about losing local farms are the folks that are going to instead put the resources elsewhere. So a pretty easy thing we could do is work with our schools and our farm policy together.
And I think it's interesting that, like, Carrie, when you were talking, you said, like, I don't want to ask for subsidies for small producers, but I think, like, putting that question in the hands of the taxpayers, like, would I rather fund a manure shed that's going to hold a bunch of waste from these industrial operations, or if I'd rather fund something that's going to provide me with a healthier future? Like, I think that's a no-brainer for any taxpayer if they're transparently seeing, the way the subsidies are flowing and how they work. That brings me to Carrie Balkcom. How do you think that AGA helps consumers to find solutions on their own plate, as well as helps producers to make those solutions happen?
Well, I said today on a call that Michael and I were on earlier, and I said my inbox looks like a sock drawer these days because there's so many things going on right now. For the first time in many, many, many years, there's a glimmer of hope legislatively. It's a small amount. There's a shift. It's not a paradigm shift, but it's a small shift in the thinking of people that we have elected to represent us. And I make that distinction because they are not leaders, they are representatives, and they need to be listening to us. 90% of the farmers that the USDA represents are farmers like Carrie, but they don't get any of the money. Now, this last year, and with the wonderful things that and I'll take part credit of it. AGA did. Greg Gunthorpe, who's on our and Sherri and those kind of people. We got $100 million in appropriations to help with overtime for small processors because they were having to pay these inspectors $100 an hour to stay after and do an extra shift when the big plants closed down. All the small processors who were processing for Carrie and everybody else picked up the gauntlet and started processing, but they were paying, if they had an 8-hour shift, they were paying $800 extra a day to do that. And their margins are so small, they couldn't do that. So that's something that that we should all be very proud of. And we should support those small processors and buy from people who are supporting them. The other thing is there's a lot of stuff out there. You know, I occasionally, with my sock drawer analogy, I talk about throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. There's a lot of legislation. There's a lot of stuff going on right now with changing things, but we have to stay cognizant of what's going on. We have to stay right on top of it because it gets lost in translation very quickly, as Chris knows, and we have to read the fine print, as Sherri knows. And in order to help Carrie and those other people that we're supporting it, and is to make sure that what we do, it doesn't have unintended consequences for them. We don't need more regulation. We need to get away from the one size fits all ag policy and make it more equitable for different producers. And this is something that we at AGA have been working on probably since 2007. And they're small steps, but they're steps. And used to come home and just want to let the world stop. And now I just want to keep moving on about it. So those are very small things that we're working on. The other thing too that what they talk about that Sherri and Chris have talked about with the externalized costs is that 40% of the food in this country is wasted. We are overproducing food, and we need to stop doing that. We need to be more efficient with food. And if we took all that food that is being wasted, that you are paying for to dispose of, and took that and did a more of economy scale and put Carrie and the other producers who are doing grass-fed and pasture in that mix, and stop paying people to overproduce food, which we do every day. And I think that's an important argument as well, moving forward, solution moving forward. Somebody said the other day, what is your advocacy called? And I said, it's called solution-based advocacy, and that's what we're working for. We're not going to advocate without a solution somewhere on the horizon in my lifetime. So anyway.
Getting a lot of good questions in the chat. Please keep them coming, guys. If anybody's interested in submitting a question, at the bottom, there's the Q&A function. Cindy, I see you have your hand up. We'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to ask one more question. And again, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A function. And Carrie, I'm going to probe you one more time for one more part of that answer, because I really think this is important here. And, with labeling, it's kind of hard to know whether you're supporting a solution or you're supporting a part of the problem. And I think that AGA makes it really clear for the consumer whether they're making the right choice or the wrong choice. And I want you to kind of expand on that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think, are you talking to which Carrie?
I meant Carrie Balkcom, but Carrie Richards, that's great as well.
I can just be really short. We originally became American Grass-Fed certified because we wanted that stamp of approval. We wanted people to read our product and know exactly what it was. So that is why we chose to use that label.
And from the other thing too, is that one of the reasons that seal is very important to producers is that there's a mislabeling of being allowed to come in with products of the USA. Beef is coming in from all over the world and being repackaged in some way when it hits the port, that now can claim that it's product of the USA. And we did a campaign a couple of years ago, and Michael and I'll dust it off and put it back up there. It was called the 10,000 Mile Meat Campaign. And countries from all over the world were sending their meat into our country at a cheaper price that's being subsidized, and Carrie's having to compete with it in the marketplace because it says product of the USA, and it's not. So we have filed petitions, we have beat the drum everywhere, and we're, again, it's not a very loud drum, but we're beating it regularly.
All right. And this to our last that I think we've kind of been pointing at the whole night, and that's what policies are needed to drive meaningful change in our broken food system.
Well, the first thing is as Chris and Sherri both said, and I'm sounding, is to make true cost of food, to take all those externalized costs and put them back on the people that are causing all of this degradation, and make them pay for the whole thing, like Carrie does. She doesn't get any subsidy from the government. She doesn't, if something goes wrong at her ranch, it comes out of her pocket. JFK said years ago, he said, the American farmer is the only person that pays wholesale both ways and then pays the freight. So that's the American farmer. It's not the corporation. It's and you have to look at the seal, and you have to do a little search. And we do as much of that, Sherri's our organization does, Chris does, to get behind the little red barn on the package. So the informed consumer is our best defense.
I can speak a little bit.
I think.
Go ahead. Sorry, Chris.
Go ahead, please. Nope.
The Zoom wars of who talks next. I can just speak in two parts to that question, Michael. We obviously, in general, we want a climate smart, food and agriculture system that works for producers, the environment, and society. Like that's very general. Carrie was talking about supply management, price parity, access to markets for producers. There's all these things in terms of stricter oversight of these industrial livestock operations, fewer taxpayer subsidies for these industrial scale businesses, incentives for smaller farmers to get started. Access to land is a huge problem, especially for socially disadvantaged farmers. We need policy that supports just, resilient, democratic agriculture systems that work in concert with nature. And that's just simply. There are a couple of, or a few acts that are actually being introduced into the Congress this year, or have already been introduced, and they're being reintroduced. But the Climate Stewardship Act is one of them. The Farm System Reform Act is one of them. Agriculture Resilience Act is one of them. They all have good things. They're not all perfect, but they are definitely in going in the right direction. I think that now is a really good time with this administration to really talk about these issues and see where we can get with them. The Agriculture Resilience Act does all kinds of things in terms of climate research, investing in on-farm energy production, supporting pasture-based livestock systems, et cetera, and reducing food waste, which Carrie talked about. The Climate Stewardship Act is bolstering research and initiatives and increasing investments also in on-farm energy production, and also protecting wetlands and restoring them and that sort of thing, as well as getting some funding to beginning farmers. And the Farm System Reform Act is calling for major agricultural reform. So that's like supporting independent family farmers, like what we're talking about, protecting the communities that SRAP serves and the public health, and overhauling this corporate consolidated system that we have right now. It calls for the immediate ban of construction of new large factory farms. And it also hopes to, or will actually phase out existing large factory farms by 2040 if it were to be passed. So there's several options that are out there right now that either have been introduced or are going to, like the Farm System Reform Act will be reintroduced this year. I don't think it's been reintroduced yet, but there's some potential. Obviously, we have potential with the Farm Bill. It doesn't really need a Band-Aid approach. It needs an overhaul. But I think if we're, I don't think we're going to have extreme change overnight, but we can certainly call for some of these good policies that do support, localized food systems and rural communities and independent farmers, and really just pull for them and some tighter regulation on these really large industrial scale operations. Sorry, Chris, I'll let you go now.
Well, I was going to say, we can really get into the weeds in terms of regulatory things, but to use our time better, perhaps, I think climate change is really the game changer. You know, it is the gorilla in the room. And one thing that I think we should be recognizing in our policy nationally and statewide is the fact that healthy soils are one of our key solutions out of our climate change problem. The sequestration of carbon is going to occur if we have more farms like the Richards instead of, you know, methane emitting and other noxious gas emitting facilities. So that's a resource. The soil is a living, you know, organism. It's not some kind of lifeless, you know, veneer that we grow a product in and dump a bunch of chemicals on and water until we get our product. If we actually do soil management and soil care, soil stewardship, it's part of the solution for climate change. It's a big part of it. And we should be paying farmers who are doing that with our federal dollars. The US pays through the NRCS, the wetland set-asides, you know, on farm fields that Sherri was talking about, or buffer strips along streams, or even leaving fields fallow for one reason or another. And there are financial incentives for farmers, growers, landowners to do that. Well, this is important. You know, there should be a scale of healthy soils by region, and those farmers who are shepherding and nurturing their soils the best should be the ones getting those kinds of incentives. That's one thing we could do right now under the current structure of the Farm Bill and how we're used to doing things.
Carrie, did you have a comment for that, Carrie Richards?
Yeah, I agree with that. We take part in some NRCS contracts, which is lovely and is really helpful. But what I really need, and what farmers and ranchers that have learned about holistic management or regenerative, what they really need is help with that transition. We didn't have help with that, and it was very difficult to basically start over. And I think that people learn about these new, you know, not new practices, but old ways of ranching and farming, and how it's really stewarding the land and the soil, like Chris said. You're really protecting the soil and keeping it alive. And to shift your focus from the animals to the soil, it's a tough jump for people. And so the education is really, really important, and support for those people that do want to make the transition is very important, because it's scary. Maybe your family's farmed or ranched one way forever, and you don't know who to reach out to for support. So, I mean, as like against subsidies as I am, I think helping farmers and ranchers make that transition to better practices is key to this, but also making it easy. Some contracts I've gotten for, you know, hedgerows and things, they're not simple to implement. And so a lot of ranchers will sign up for these contracts and never do them. So we're all, you know, tired ranchers. And so we want things to be simple. And so it's hard to change our ways. And we realize that, but to me, it was a no-brainer, but for someone else, it may not be. So I don't really have a solution here, but I think that helping people with the transition to a more holistic way of ranching or farming is a big key to this.
We try and do as much of that as we can within the confines of keeping it affordable. The other thing too is that keeping it affordable for the rancher, because every time the consumer asks the rancher to do something, it costs them money. And that Carrie's food may seem expensive, but it's not compared to, again, the other things is that consumer wants organic, and consumer wants this, and consumer wants that, and consumer wants the other thing. And she's willing to spend time on the phone with me and everybody else to say, how do I do this? But it's taking away from her family. It's taking away from her farm. It's taking away from her pocketbook. And so I think that we have to understand that when we ask for these things, we have to be willing to pay for it. And that's what you're doing when you pay for Carrie Richards' food, is that you're paying for her expertise and her knowledge. And God love her, from the first minute she called me on the phone, it's been an ongoing conversation. And a lot of our farmers do that. And they reach out to me, they reach out to Michael, they reach out to other members of our team constantly. And we're willing to help, but we've got to have the consumer pitch in. And like I say, we have a rancher, a farmer in South Georgia who's kind of iconic. And he said, you know, my farm is not scalable. He said, but it is replicable. And that's what we're trying to do, is we don't want to have an economy of scale. We want to have a lot of little Carrie Richards and White Oak Pastures and Rain Pro ranches and other farmers. And what's the guy in Indiana, Sherri? Chris.
Chris Baggett, yes.
Chris Baggett and Greg Cornthorpe's. We want to have them all over the country supporting their farms and supporting their rural economies. So that's what we're going to do, is continue to do that, and to hopefully help the consumer understand that, you know, this is putting Carrie's kids through school. This is not buying a second home for somebody offshore. This is real time. And, you know, that's what I'm hoping that we're getting through on these webinars that we're doing, is making sure that it's good for us to spend a little extra to make sure that those people that Carrie and all these other ranchers and farmers survive.
If I can add something, not only for the farmers and ranchers to survive, but everyone in that food system supply chain. So Carrie Richards, if I can speak to you and change you for a second, I think you should own the idea of that subsidy, because the government has the choice to either fund something really good for our world and our country and our citizens and our residents, or it has the choice to fund something really bad. And not every consumer may be able to afford you, no matter how well or efficient you are. But the government has a choice to make good food available to everyone who lives in this country. And so I think it's really, really important that we don't, you know, demonize the subsidy idea, because if whatever we call it, incentivizing these farmers to transition, which is a huge, very important point. So I'm super happy you brought it up. But I believe that, like, the government has a choice to funnel their money one way or the other. And what they should do is to funnel their money to build a better food system that's going to create healthy, fresh, nutritious food so people can be healthy. And really, that's what we have to push for. So if they're going to put billions of dollars one way, then we have to push for that billions of dollars to go the other way, because that's the right thing to do. And we lose these fights often, as Carrie Balkcom and I know, like, we've been to DC together. We don't always win, but we don't lose sleep at night, because we know we're sleeping on the right side of these issues, and we have to keep pushing for them. And if I can ever do anything for consumers to get them to understand, is like, we have to keep pushing for something better. Everyone in this country deserves really good food and access to it. So, like, I would say, you know, I know it's hard to, my family fights all the time if we try to buy each other dinner, right? It's hard to say, okay, I'm going to take this handout, but at the same point in time, the government's handing out food for a system that's literally killing us in multiple ways. And so at some point we have to say, okay, we're going to stop letting you kill us now, and we're going to fight for living. And so that's, like, to me, it's really important that we remember that. Sorry to totally pinpoint you, but
All good. I can take it.
Or,
Well, I think,
or even
Go ahead,
simpler,
Go
or
ahead, Chris.
even simpler, where government spends their money procuring food for prisons, immigration facilities, schools, the military, what have you, they should be buying it from the right sources, not the wrong sources. So easy to do. And we're doing just the opposite.
for sure.
Absolutely. And if you, for anybody that's listening to the call, if you do want to support one of the people that's doing it the right way, be sure to visit our website at www.americangrassfed.org. and go to our consumers tab where you can find a producer near you, whether that's Carrie Richards or one of our other couple hundred producers that are doing things the right way. With that, I'm going to open up to some other questions coming in from the attendees, if that's all right with everyone. And I see a lot in the chat. I also see a hand raised out there. So if anyone would like to raise their hand or continue to put questions in the chat, please feel free. And I'm going to start off with Maria Payan. I'm going to open up her mic. She has her hand raised. All right, we have Maria, we have your.
So I've been listening to this, and you guys know I'm like into this from morning till night and head to toe. But I think Carrie Richards, what you said in the very beginning, it's just that simple, right? The first thing you said was the policy is being driven to get bigger and bigger. But what do consumers want? What do we want, right? We don't want bigger and bigger. And this whole conversation is just so good because this is what we need to do. I think about, do you remember when Food Inc. came out? It was 1 in 3 people that were born after the year 2000 would have diabetes. If you were in a minority community, 2 out of 3 born after the year 2000 would have, because of our diets. And it's all that we're talking about, right? The system is driving it there. The school lunches, the prisons, you know, all of these systems where we have all these great farmers who want to farm the right way. The consumers want it. We have, I think, such a good opportunity here with this administration because of the very strong focus on those that are marginalized and systemic racism, where you have communities, you know, where a lot of times the school lunches is what they depend upon to get nutritious meals. I don't know if the general public has ever done this. I have, and it's mortifying. Look at other countries, what is in their school lunches, and look at our country, what is in our school lunch, and you'll be horrified because they actually have nutritious, dense food that is sustainably grown. It looks nothing like our school lunches. And I think this is so important if we talk about our healthcare system, right? The drain and the cost, a lot of this is because of our diets. Our diets are making us unhealthy. So I think a lot of, you know, my brain's spinning. I'm thinking about the Food and Farm Network, and I'm thinking about all of these things. And the answer should be just as simple as the consumer needs to demand that. I don't think it's bad for small farmers to ask for subsidies. I don't see it as a handout. I see it as an investment, right? Because if we're giving subsidies to, and I'm sure a lot of the general public don't realize that the subsidies going into the big industrial operations, people are paying for manure pits. How many people understand that they are paying for a system? I mean, literally, it's not only have they been able to keep this kind of practice out of public view, but they've also been able to keep the propping up of this system out of public view. And I saw somebody in the chat say, you know, most people don't realize this. And it's true. I think we need to do a lot more discussions because I think the consumer, we need them to push for 4 things, right, that are going to protect our soils. We need them forever. We need it to grow food for us. So I think it's important.
Thank you.
Maria, it's amazing.
Full disclosure is that we have a 2nd generation advocate on an American Grassfed because the woman that you just heard about works for Sherri. So I want to make darn sure that we know that she's raising her son correctly. So yeah,
Absolutely. And I think it's super important that you all are talking about hunger or you know, the idea that folks aren't getting access to food in this country. the industry wants us to believe that they have to exist and operate the way they do in order to feed the world, right? Well, we're not even feeding the people that live in this country. We have 1 in 4 kids that goes hungry every day. So there's a problem in our own country that we're not handling. And so the idea that we have to feed the world is completely false. And so we have to really look at, like, how is our policy supporting the system that fails absolutely everyone but the corporate interests that are driving it.
I find that statement, I've said this several times in meetings, I find the statement that we're feeding the world really arrogant when we're not. And we now need to allow the world to feed itself. We need to give people the tools to grow their own food, to manage their own food systems, and stop trying to be omnipotent with this. It's not going to work. So, I mean, I'll go get off my soapbox. No, I won't get off my soapbox. So I'm not going to do it.
That's the paradigm. That's the paradigm shift that was mentioned earlier, where we stop supporting in every way corporate agriculture and start supporting sustainable, regenerative agriculture, local agriculture. Know your farmer, know where your food comes from. It takes work. There have been some questions in the Q&A spot about, how do we do this? And it's like everything that matters in life. It's education, and it goes on all the time. It has to go on continually and constantly, or we never get anywhere. It's that tough work. It's like being a parent. It's never over. You're always going to be working and educating, and we have to, put the word out and keep it growing. And then also, this conversation reminds me of the fact, that everything is connected to everything. Maria's comments about health, the economics, environment, everything is connected. John Muir said it was all hitched together, one thing to another, and it is. And we can break the cycles if we have the power to do so, as Sherri said. But we do have the power. We do have the power. It's how we spend our dollars, whether it's, personally or publicly. So, this is unfortunately one of those issues like environmental protection that never ends. It has to continue.
Sure.
So looking at the chat, it looks like there were a couple that came up earlier. One is from Lucretia Spencer, and it asks, are you looking at the bioaccumulation of pesticides like Roundup and Grazon in the meat of grain-fed livestock and poultry?
We don't at AGA because it's not an us versus them. We try not to. The glyphosate accumulation, bioaccumulation in foodstuffs is in the internal organs, the liver, the kidneys, those kind of things. So we try and focus on the positive. I know that there are a lot of studies that have been done about the accumulation of pesticides and herbicides in the organ meat of ruminants and other animals and poultry. But since our animals are healthy, and we're going to focus on the fact that they're healthy, we don't need a lot of those things. And that's one thing that AGA does, is that not only are we looking at healthy soils, but we do a webinar series for our farmers and our producers on animal health. So we're bringing that part in as well. So we don't have to use those externals. So I understand it, and it's a problem, but we're going to focus on solution-based, and getting away from the use of those things is what we're trying to focus on. Our animals don't get grain, so they eat grass. So
Mark 10 or comments, education is such a big piece of this issue. When the president talks about people reducing their meat consumption to slow global warming, it shows how much misinformation there is regarding carbon sequestration, etc. Leave that up there. And Sheila, I see that you're asking something here, but I don't know if I'm quite clear on what you're asking. One of the comments is, I've become so aware of what you're discussing this year It seems to me that there are many organizations with the same mission. It seems like we're going in circles. Should these organizations join forces to take these overwhelming issues to the government?
Many of us have. Sherri's group, Family Farm Action. We've been endorsed by Organic Consumers. We've been endorsed by other organizations. We work very closely with all the organizations that share the common goals and solutions. It's been very important for us to make those relationships and not to splinter ourselves. So yeah, we should do more of it. And as soon as they give me one more day in the week and one more hour in every day, we'll get that too. So, but it's not something, we're not working in silos. And the fact that Sherri's on here, Chris is on here, Carrie's on here, and Maria, we're all on here, and we all network a lot.
And this is the one I might have to mic up for. And if you're willing to talk, you're definitely feel free to. You're asking if there are lobbyists for, I think you might be referring to CAFOs, but it says cafe. I'll open your mic up for a second if you'd like to ask.
Are there lobbyists?
That is right, Michael. CAFO.
Thank you, Sheila. We'll
Yes.
get to my question.
Thank you for asking my questions.
Absolutely.
Definitely. There are organizations that tell us that that's the best way to produce food in this country, and they have the ear of a lot of our, again, I'm gonna call them representatives, not leaders. And there was anecdotally, there was remember when the gentlemen who were playing softball in Washington, and they had the gunman come in and open fire on them? One of the people that was injured in that was a lobbyist for one of the biggest corporate feeders in this country. So they're not only lobby, but they're buddies. So it's very hard. And I don't play softball, but I'm just trying to make a connection there that they've been doing this a long time. When Sherri and I and the others show up, we have to fight that every day. We don't have $14 million lobbying campaigns, marketing campaigns. So
You either, when you're changing policy or you're trying to change policy, you have power either with money or with people. We do not have the $14 million or whatever Carrie just referred to that some of these industry interests have, but we do have people who care about their families and about their futures. And so I think what we really work to do, Sheila asked, if we're just running in circles. That's a really good question. Some days, honestly, it feels like we're just running in circles. Sometimes it's a lot of days that feels like that. But I think we do work in coalition with lots of other groups. I spend every day, really, I get asked to sign on to petitions for certain policy efforts and initiatives. I get asked to join coalition meetings and discussions and things. And it's always about, how are we going to address and really push for, like I said, these systems that are just, that are democratic, that are good for all, rather than just good for a very few. So we are working as smartly and as connected as we can. And we just have to keep, gathering the voices essentially of the people that we represent. Carrie with her ranchers, and the consumers who eat the AGA certified food, SRAP with the communities that we serve. We are on the ground helping these communities protect themselves and safeguard their quality of life, their public health. And we're doing it all over the country in approximately 170 counties, I think, across the country. I think that's right. I hope it's right because I just said it on this webinar, but we're all over the country working actively and engaged in a lot of different cases. And so we do as much as we can, not only to collectively work together, but also to get those voices into Washington, D.C. or into the efforts that other groups like Food and Water Watch and other organizations that are doing to push policy forward in D.C. I should also say, in terms of Sheila's question about networking, we are actually creating a food and farm network through a socially responsible agriculture project. one hand, we help communities that come to us that ask for help. So when they're in crisis mode, we are there to help give them the education and the skills to empower them to actually stand up to these forces that are coming into their communities. The Food and Farm Network is going to be a way to collaborate and to collectively work together to get those voices, like I said, and to get them advocating in terms of policy, to engage them in terms of turning them into leaders on these issues. So we're looking for people who want to be leaders in their communities on these issues. So we're going to do some leadership development. And then that movement building and that coalition building. So we'll be introducing them to the other coalitions that exist around the country, to the other networks like the Family Farm Action Alliance, et cetera. So we are really trying to find ways to better connect the communities that we serve directly and to link them into all of these other efforts.
We also, Carrie, just saying one sec, one thing that we do is that we try and out the wolf in sheep's clothing. And we don't do it stridently and carrying pitchforks, but we need to make sure that the consumer knows who's working for them and who's the wolf and the sheep. So go ahead, Carrie.
I was going to just comment on what Sherri said about, we don't have billions of dollars to spread this word, but if there's one silver lining from the pandemic last year is people wanting to know where their food comes from because the grocery stores were empty. So it shined a very, very bright light on our system. I have more friends and family that are asking me about what I'm doing than I ever have. I have more ranchers and farmers reaching out to me, people wanting to come visit because the light was shown on the problem. And now people can't unknow what they found out, which was, I have no idea where this meat's coming from. And I have no idea where any of it's coming from. So I know we can't afford lobbyists, but I think spreading the word and continuing to share our stories. And, social media is a very powerful tool, and sharing articles and what AGA is doing and what we're doing at Richard's Grassfed and what other producers are doing. I mean, that's really powerful.
I think that gets us to the end for tonight. And I want to thank all of the attendees for being here tonight and watching us for this entire hour here. And I also want to thank all the panelists that made this possible, because we couldn't do it without you guys. And it means a lot that you're here spending the time with us at AGA.